Bismillahi ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent and merciful. Assalamu alaikum. May peace, blessings, and mercy of Allah be upon you and to all the messengers of Allah, and in particular on the noble and final messenger, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his family, and his companions. Let me present to you the fourth lecture video series of CIA Part 2, Practice of Internal Auditing for all the exams beginning in 2020. We will start now with the section B, Planning the Engagement in this video. Section B has the weightage of 20% in exams. We can expect around 20 questions from this particular section. What is the requirement of the standard 2200 engagement planning? Internal auditors must develop and document a plan for each engagement, including the engagement's objectives, scope, timing, and resource allocation. The plan must consider the organization's strategies, objectives, and risks relevant to the engagement. What is needed for planning an engagement? The following are needed for planning an engagement: the objectives of the audit, the scope of the audit, the resources required to achieve the objectives, and the work program. What are the characteristics of effective work program? An effective work program should state the objectives of the engagement, document the procedures that the internal auditor will use to collect, analyze, interpret, and document information during the engagement, identify the technical elements, risks, transactions, and processes that will be examined, state the nature and extent of required testing, be prepared prior to the commencement of engagement work, but with the approval of the chief audit executive, can be modified during the course of the engagement. What may be the agenda of meeting between chief audit executive and management team whose area of responsibility is being audited? The topic of these meetings might cover the objectives and the scope of the work, the timing of the work, the internal auditors who will be performing the work, the communication process throughout the engagement, including the methods, time, frames, and individuals who will be responsible, business conditions and operations of the activity being reviewed, including recent changes in management or major systems, any concerns or requests from the management, any concerns from the internal auditor, a description of the final reporting process, and the follow up that will be conducted. What does the standard 2201 planning consideration say? In planning the engagement, internal auditors must consider the strategies and objectives of the activity that is being reviewed and the means by which the activity controls its performance, the significant risks to the activities, objectives, resources, and operations, and the means by which the potential impact of risk is kept to an acceptably level, the adequacy and effectiveness of the activities risk management and control systems compared to a relevant control framework or model, the opportunities for making significant improvements to the activities risk management and control processes. What are the requirements of standard 2210 engagement objectives? Objectives must be established for each engagement. Internal auditors must conduct a preliminary assessment of the risk relevant to the activity under review. Engagement objectives must reflect the results of this assessment. Internal auditors must consider the probability of significant errors, fraud, non-compliance, and other exposures when developing the engagement objectives. Adequate criteria are needed to evaluate governance, risk management, and controls. Internal auditors must ascertain the extent to which management and the board has established adequate criteria to determine whether objectives and goals have been accomplished. If adequate internal auditors must use such criteria in their evaluation. If inadequate, internal auditors must identify appropriate evaluation criteria through discussion with the management and the board. What are the requirements of the standard 2220 engagement scope? The established scope must be sufficient to satisfy the objectives of the engagement. The scope of the engagement must include consideration of relevant systems, records, personnel, and physical properties, including those under the control of third parties. If significant consulting opportunities arise during an assurance engagement, a specific written understanding as to the objectives, scope, respective responsibilities, and other expectations should be reached, and the results of the consulting engagement communicated in accordance with the consulting standards. In performing consulting engagements, internal auditors must ensure that the scope of the engagement is sufficient to address the agreed upon objectives. If internal auditors develop reservations about the scope during the engagement, these reservations must be discussed with the client to determine whether to continue with the engagement. During consulting engagements, internal auditors must address controls consistent with the engagement objectives and be alert to significant control issues. What are the requirements of the standard 2240 engagement work program? Internal auditors must develop and document work programs that achieve the engagement objectives. Work programs must include the procedures for identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and documenting information during the engagement. The work program must be approved prior to its implementation and any adjustments approved promptly. Work programs for consulting engagements may vary in form and content depending upon the nature of the engagement. What the engagement work program contains? The engagement work program contains the list of necessary procedures, and it also serves as a supervisory tool to make sure that all of the required and expected procedures are performed. It is important that the work program is prepared and completed before to the start of the engagement because it is the essential roadmap for completing the audit. The audit program should include information about the objectives of the area that is being audited, a description of the controls that are currently in place, a description of controls that should be in place. What are the characteristics of audit evidence? All audit evidence must be able to stand the test of sufficiency, reliability, competency, and relevance. What is the sufficiency of evidence? Sufficiency of the evidence is determined through the auditor's professional judgment. One method to determine the appropriate level of evidence is to look at the effectiveness of the client's internal controls and risks. More evidence is needed to determine sufficiency when internal controls are not functioning effectively, inherent risk is high, and materiality is high. What is the reliability of evidence? Evidence must be reliable, meaning that the auditor can believe and trust the evidence. The most reliable evidence is any information that is obtained directly by the auditor, most often through first hand observation. However, there is a great deal of information that cannot be obtained directly, and as a result, the auditor will need to rely on other resources. What is the relevant evidence? For information to be considered relevant, it must relate specifically to the item being audited. Irrelevant information can be distracting, distort results, and waste resources. However, an auditor should not automatically disregard or ignore information that on its surface might appear to be irrelevant. What is useful evidence? Useful evidence is information that helps the organization meet its goals. Locating and identifying useful information is one of the main goals of the internal audit activity. What are the two sources of evidence? There are two main types of auditing evidence. Number one, underlying accounting data is primary information that comes from the accounting system, including original documents, journals, ledgers, supporting information, and the output from the accounting systems. This type of evidence by itself is not sufficient and it will always need to be verified with corroborative evidence. Number two, corroborative evidence is secondary information that supports the primary data. It is generally evidence that is obtained from outside the accounting system and that can be verified with a third party, such as an invoice, a check, contracts, or similar types of documents. What are the four types of evidence? There are four types of evidence. Number one, testimonial evidence. Evidence Testimonial evidence is evidence obtained through direct first person interviews. Second, documentary evidence. Documentary evidence is the evidence in the document form. Physical evidence. Physical evidence is based on physical objects. For example, does the asset really exist? Analytical evidence. Analytical evidence is the evidence that comes from comparing, computing, or otherwise analyzing data. All evidence must be confirmed, corroborated, or otherwise substantiated. What are the selected engagement procedures? There are six categories of procedures. Number one, observing. Observing is a visual examination of a specific item or event by the auditor. It may involve observing a specific document or the application of an internal control procedure. All observations should be described and documented. Number two, questioning. Questioning is usually the best way to determine what a person thinks or feels about a particular subject, and so the auditor may conduct an in person interview or send a questionnaire. In person interviews are the most common approach, but there are potential pitfalls. Interviews require the auditor to create effective questions, develop appropriate follow up questions, and interpret answers with insight and intelligence. Any information obtained through questioning should be confirmed, if possible, either by other individuals or by other evidence. Number three, analyzing. Analyzing means drawing conclusions based on a careful survey of the evidence. In general, analysis involves comparing related items, noting trends in information, and looking at differences between actual and expected results. Effective auditors will be trained in many different methods of obtaining and analyzing evidence to make the strongest, most intelligent judgments possible. Number four, verifying. Verifying is the process of checking one source of information against the another. Corroborating evidence is information that supports the facts or assertions found in another piece of evidence. A single piece of evidence may not be sufficient to support a conclusion, but two or more forms of corroborating evidence can support the conclusion that a fact has been verified. Investigating. Investigating is searching for evidence or facts that are not easily or readily available. When dealing with large volumes of information, the auditor may have to carefully sift through piles of documents, examine electronic records, or conduct extensive research to find a specific piece of information. In some instances, information may have been deliberately hidden, obscured, or destroyed, especially in cases of suspected wrongdoing. In those situations, the auditor will need to employ more aggressive investigative techniques to uncover what has happened. The search for wrongdoing is called a probe. Number 6, evaluating. In evaluating, the auditor collects all available information, organizes it, and develops a reasoned, documented support conclusion. In preparing an evaluation, the auditor must rely on a great deal of professional judgment because there will always be areas where suppositions and inferences must be made. In the case of internal auditing, evaluations are made with respect to financial balances, internal control procedures, and risk assessment. The process of evaluation will include a number of different considerations: the number of deviations, the size of the deviations, the reason why the deviations occurred, the area in which the deviations occurred, whether the deviations will likely occur again. What is the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning? Inductive reasoning begins with a specific item and then draws general, broad conclusions about it. For example, an auditor samples receivables in order to conclude that accounts receivable exist as recorded. Deductive reasoning begins with a general statement and then draws specific conclusions based on that generality. For example, an auditor performs analytical procedures in order to estimate the accuracy of a particular account balance. What is tracing? In tracing, the auditor starts with a piece of information from a source document and follows it through the accounting records until it reaches the final ledger. This test for completeness makes sure that every event or transaction is appropriately recorded. What is vouching? Vouching is the opposite of tracing. The auditor starts with an amount in a ledger and searches for the documentation that supports it. This is a test for existence or occurrence, and it makes certain that every event or transaction that has been recorded in the records has occurred. All the topics presented in this video has been taken from my CIA Part 2 Practice of Internal Auditing study book for 2020. The link to subscribe the same is mentioned in the description of the video. Please share your feedback, recommendation and comments. Have a nice day, take care and Allah Hafiz.